Hey everyone, this is the Data Rules podcast, where you chat with experts in the reporting automation industry and we just nerd out and talk about marketing data. I'm your host, Victor Dwyer, and our guest today is JJ Reynolds, founder of Mediauthentic, BetterThanData, and Looker Studio VIP. JJ excels at helping companies measure and take action on their marketing data. So we're excited to have you as a guest today. Before we dive into how to make marketing data more actionable for businesses and clients, JJ, please give us an intro about yourself and what you're currently working on.
Hey, thanks so much for that intro, Victor. My name is JJ Reynolds. I'm originally from Hawaii. I was born and raised in Hawaii. That was my fun fact of the day. And currently living out in Reno, Nevada.
Mhm.
So if anyone's in Reno, swing on by, hit me up on LinkedIn. Let's grab a coffee. And yeah, manage those three companies where we do a variety of things. Media Authentic is the agency where we manage kind of end to end building out actionable reporting. A lot of strategy goes into that because
Mhm.
at the end of the day, like action is better than data. That's kind of what my motto is, at least. And we have an agency training program where we talk about this stuff with agencies and consultants who want to start offering data as a service. So yeah, that's all the things, and happy to dive into any aspect of that with you.
Yeah, that's a great intro. I'm so big on making actionable dashboards because I can put a million data points on a dashboard where you're just overwhelmed with numbers. But the human brain can only process so many things. So it is super important to have the right KPIs that are going to actually be important to that client and based off the person. For example, if I'm showing a dashboard to a CEO, it's going to look a lot different. It's going to be very surface level information to what that CEO needs. But if I'm doing it off an execution person, the person that is needs all the nitty gritty, the product by product data or things like that, those dashboards going to be separate. So I really have to analyze the person and say, okay, what are the things that are important to this person at this level? And then create something that's actually going to be useful for them rather than just scan it and just never look at it again. So I totally agree with you on creating actionable dashboards there.
Yeah, definitely. And the way that I like to think of it is
Mhm.
like when we say actionable dashboards, people take that a lot of different ways. But
Yep.
the way you want to think about it is like a good old Venn diagram. I know I'm on a podcast, I'm like, look at this chart. But just think of like
Yeah.
on one side, you have the action somebody can take, and then you have the insights that you can provide. And
Yep.
the intersect between that is what you want to hit. For example, like you just said, the CEO. If I give a CEO like a dashboard with like the ad set level breakdown of like a Facebook ad campaign, like they can't do anything. They don't know how to edit a campaign. Not even saying that they couldn't do it, but like they don't know how. That's
Yeah.
something that like a media buyer would be doing. And if you give a
Mhm.
media buyer the quarterly projections versus the actual revenues, they're like, okay, like we didn't hit that. Awesome. I don't know what to do. Do I hit
Yeah.
publish more? Right. So like
Yeah.
that is like the extremes that you want to think of when you're designing something is what action can the person looking at it take? Because you need to have their skill set and their area of expertise in mind when you're designing it. So, like, kind of
Yeah.
resaying what you just said, but just kind of building that even further for whoever's
Mhm.
listening to this to be like, oh, I can't just build a report with all these KPIs that are huge because they don't mean anything to the actual practitioner and vice versa.
And I think what's made me a very effective dashboard builder is I have context about what I'm building it about. So, for example, if someone asks me for an Amazon dashboard, I know exactly what KPIs are there because I live and breathe Amazon. Like anything when it comes to that, I know exactly what KPIs are going to be useful for a client, for a CEO, because I live and breathe Amazon. Even if it was Facebook, for example, I have a lot of context about Facebook. So I know, hey, here's an ad dashboard that shows you all the best performing ad graphics. Here's an ad set level to show you what audiences are performing well. And that's because I have context about Facebook. So, in my opinion, I think the dashboard creator should just watch a 10-minute video on whatever data source they're creating it about, just so they have context on it. That would make them a lot more effective. So that way they say, okay, this is what's going to be insightful for them. And so that way they just have a little bit more context about what they're creating about rather than kind of just taking shots in the dark. I think that makes a person a lot more effective dashboard builder. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you have to have done it in order to build something around
Yeah.
it. Otherwise, it's very difficult. I skipped over in my little intro. Like I was a Facebook ad consultant and then I ran Google ads before that at an agency.
Mhm.
That gives me as a person, like that background. But when
Yeah.
we're training team members, I ran face first into this, like at the agency, of like hiring somebody who can build great dashboards, like visually. But
Mhm.
then you're like, oh, build a Facebook ad set breakdown by audience or whatever. And they're like, I don't even know what an ad set is. And you're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, like you don't have this background. Like it's my fault, not your fault. And so like that is something that you really want to think about, especially when you're working on multiple things. And I think the differentiator between like a basic thing that you can go buy off Fiverr, like of like, hey, here's a report, right? And then like the actual like high level reporting that we do, where it's like very in depth, very specific, very actionable, is the wealth of knowledge that you have about the underlying information and then what actions you can take. Because like you might be able
Mhm.
to report, you're like, oh, you need to like segment this audience by gender in Facebook ads, but you're like, that's not even physically possible. We can't do that. Like you can do that
Yeah.
right now, but like imagine if you couldn't.
Mhm.
And so you have to know what's possible to build that report.
I think a really important aspect about all of it is if you can make the action even more feasible, then it's even 1,000 times better. So, like, for example, I might make like a table with all the ad graphics within Facebook, within the Facebook ad dashboard. But what I might do is I might do a low performing ad graphics and high performing ad graphics. So not only am I showing both pieces in a certain way, I'm making it where I'm saying, here are the poor ones, here are the good ones. And then what I can do is I can have that always there where the ad graphic team can screenshot it and send that to the creative team and say, hey, create more of these. These are performing really well. So there's certain ways to show information rather than, yes, you can break it out by ad level, but you can also break it out by positive and negative ad graphics where you can eventually send that to your graphic team, or you can create your own dashboard for that graphic team so they constantly keep iterating and making different versions. So where I'm going with it, it's super important to be creating it whatever's most valuable to the client and asking them like, hey, do you have a creative team? What is most important to you? Is it constant creative iterations? So you have to start by understanding what the platform and data source is first, and then you can eventually get to the point where you can start iterating and making those dashboards. I totally agree with what you're saying there. Is there any other insight that you want to provide there when it comes to making actionable dashboards or anything else there?
Like it comes down to the good questions. Like you have to ask good
Mhm.
questions to start off with. We do a lot with like Google Analytics and like custom CRM things along those lines. So like we can change the data collection. Like with Facebook and Amazon and things like that, like you can't really change the data collection point. Like it's kind of standardized. Like you're not like gonna, oh yeah, I want to also see like the number of people who hovered over this thing. Like you're not getting that from Amazon.
Yeah.
Um, and so like with more custom implementations, if you can customize the CRM or can customize the browser based metrics and things, you get the ability to then ask bigger questions that you can take action on. So again, I start with the question regardless of what you're doing, because at the end of the day, the question is what matters, and then everything else after that is kind of the trickle down. If you ask a terrible question, like I always like say, like if you have an e-commerce store, right, and you're like, oh, like when it rains in the zip code, it like makes me make more money, right? I'm like,
Yeah.
so like
Yeah.
we should have a report where it breaks down the precipitation by zip code and sales.
Mhm.
And I'm like, hold up, guys. Like if you can make it rain, that's gonna be a much better business model than
Yeah.
selling your widget. So like this
Yeah.
you can't influence. Like if it rains or not rains, like if we have a drought year, like you're just like, oh, sales are down. Like, oh, it didn't rain this year. Guys, CEO, CFO, don't worry, it didn't rain this year. Like that's not helpful. So ask better
Yeah.
questions as opposed to like building out reports just because you can.
100%. Things that you can actually change rather than just saying, "Oh, that's a cool aspect about it."
Yeah.
I totally agree. And I wanna dive into a little bit about what are some things that you shouldn't do when it comes to building dashboards?
Well, I think when it comes to building like a report
Mhm.
and like a dashboard, is what are they supposed to do? And I think that's like
Yeah.
the core of it is do not just throw a bunch of things on there because it's not going to be helpful. And oftentimes, like a single number can be infinitely valuable.
Yeah.
And getting to that single number, like you could just put a single number on a page and be like, this is the like average days to first transaction from all leads. everybody, our goal is to lower this number by any means necessary. And
Yeah.
getting that number is extremely difficult, right? Like to
Mhm.
calculate where the leads are coming from, where are the sales coming from, how long is it taking between them? Has this person already purchased before they became a lead? Because then that excludes them from this, right? So
Yeah.
like that's an extremely complicated question, but it yields a single number. And
Yeah.
so like what I'd say not to do is don't just start adding, like I've seen so many templates where you just add like all these things and you're just like, oh my goodness, this is not helpful, because
Yeah.
there's just you're just basically building like Facebook Ads Manager in a
Mhm.
Looker Studio report. Go to Business Manager. Don't go here. Right. And so like what you don't want to do is just add infinite amount of information because you can, especially if it's a single source. Like if you're just building a Facebook ads dashboard that is
Mhm.
literally what is inside of Facebook Ads Manager, stop. Give them like we've really done this before, is like add a hyperlink to the Facebook Ads Manager so that
Wow.
like they just click on that and then they're now in Ads Manager to go edit the thing. As opposed to trying, like we're like, hey, want more information? Click this button. Bam, you're an Ad Manager. Like, don't just overload with information, and usually less is more. It's like what not to do, and also wrapped with what to do. Like, don't add a lot. Do make it simple.
And what would you say is a good balance? And I know that's a super loaded question between complexity and simple, and I know that differs by client, by data source, and things like that. The way I've done it in the past is I've always changed it by chart. So, for example, I might have my top being scorecards and KPIs where it has numbers. And then to create like a visual brain break is the best way to call it, then I might have a time series chart where it's a like basically a line. And I try to incorporate different charts so that way it's not just all numbers or all lines or all pie charts type of thing. And I try to create visual brain breaks, is I guess the best way to call it. That way it's a little bit more simplified rather than giving it all in one type of chart, if that makes sense. So, is there any other things that you've done in the past to create these visual brain breaks or to simplify data? Is there anything else that you can think of there?
I think simplifying in general across the dashboard, right? If we're talking about Looker Studio, we're talking about like add multiple pages, like simplify the page. A lot of times we just add scorecards that, like,
Yeah.
for everyone who's watching, the scorecard is a single number,
Yeah.
a single number that's like total revenue, right?
Mhm.
But like no one cares most of the time what those scorecards are at the top of the page. We're just adding them because we can. Like, and no one looks at them. So we used to do this like where there's like a dashboard home and it's like all like revenue, all the like kind of big KPIs that like everyone looks at, and like a trend, basically like a line chart of like revenue per day. And no one looked at it. Like no one cares
Mhm.
about like those single numbers. And if they
Mhm.
do care, they just go log into Stripe. And they're just like, hey, how much money we make? Right. And like
Yeah.
your dashboard should be more helpful than providing those like higher levels. So like, why do you have this? And I'd say like, I would
Mhm.
implore everybody listening is look at your report and say, what am I going to do with this number? So like in like the visual, like, yes, we need to have like visual breaks and things, but like go for more pages that are simpler. Don't just
Yeah.
have like a giant page that has like visual breaks, because you're just using those for to fill up space as opposed to being like, oh, if this number is below this thing, you go push this button and call the director of whatever. Like
Yeah.
that's how like we like to build it, where it's like we try to have every single chart where it's like this is the goal, this is the like break glass moment. If it's below this number, go call whoever's in charge of this because it is not working. That's a very long explanation to say like try to keep like we like prefer simpler with more pages, so like you can get your answer, get back to work, as opposed to like trying to investigate like the whole page of like, oh yeah, da, 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 da. Cool, I don't care about that number, and then you can keep down the page. So like that's a very long-winded explanation of like simple is kind of like the goal here, and visually, as long as it's simple, it doesn't matter if you have 5 elements or 8 elements, but just don't
Mhm.
have 50 elements.
What is your QA process with clients? Do you go through and say, "Hey, do you care about this number? Do you care about this number? Do you care about this number?" Like, what's your QA process where you're saying like, "Hey, how can I make this the most actionable for you?" And because who knows, like cost per lead might be super important for one client and not important for another. So what's your QA process to try to build the KPIs? Do you ask it up front? Like, hey, tell me all these things that are necessary to you guys. Like, what's your process for like understanding what's valuable to the client?
Yeah, I love the question. So this is my acronym. It's JJism. I call it WIGDI, which is what are you going to do about it? And like
Okay.
WIGDI is like the acronym.
Uh-huh.
And that's it. Like some clients, like cost per lead, that's like the most leading indicator. And if their cost per lead goes up, like they need to start fixing stuff. Other
Mhm.
clients are like, hey, we don't care. Like our goal is 100 leads a month, regardless of cost or whatever,
Wow.
like $1,000
That's
a lead.
nice.
Yeah. And they're just like, we will make money, but like our goal is this. And obviously it's like a trailing, like cost is like type of thing. So we'll usually ask them, like, here's this report, right? And you've asked these questions because I'd say like about 80% of the time, like we're kind of engineering the questions for them of like, here's the
Mhm.
questions you should be asking. Because most people just ask the big questions of like, what's our conversion rate? And I'm like, that's useless. Like, doesn't matter. Like the conversion rate
Uh-huh.
is like overall for a site, it's between 1 to 3%. Like every e-commerce
Mhm.
store on planet Earth is between 1 to 3%. Like you can make the worst site on Earth and it's like 1 to 3%. Like
Yeah.
and so what's a
Yeah.
better question is like, how is this page like doing its job? Like, is
Yeah.
this page, this product page, like are people doing the thing that you want them to do? Yes or no? And so like
Mhm.
80% of the time it's us engineering the questions. And then 20% of the time it's them asking a question of like, hey, I want to know this, this, and this. And then we like work with them to be like, okay, if this is below 5% or 50, like 1500 or whatever the thing is, like, what are you going to do about it? Like, let's just hard code that sucker in. If this is below 1.5%, call Susan. So that's kind of our QA process on that.
That's awesome. I love that. And it also is important to know, like, you're so right. Like when it comes, what are you going to do about it? If you were to track your conversion rate on the overall all the pages on a website on an e-commerce store, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter because not only are you tracking every page, you're tracking your home pages, your blog pages, your product pages, and that's really not that useful. But if you were doing it, for example, on a product level, where you're saying, okay, product A conversion rate went up 30%, but product B conversion rate went down 100%, then you're like, okay, what is going on with product B? Like something's wrong. And then you say, oh, product B, the content's all messed up, the image is all messed up, and then you know what to do about it. So
Yeah,
like it
exactly.
yes. And it's important to like not only aggregate it all, because when it's aggregated, it's not very useful. But when it's broken apart, then it's actually actionable from that point.
Yeah, and so you have to decide where you're gonna break it, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you looked at every single individual user, like, that's not very helpful, but, like, you have
Yeah.
to aggregate at some point, so we're gonna aggregate sessions. Okay, cool. Like, sessions per what? Per page, per category, per site, per, like, whatever. So, like, that's a very important, like, piece is, like, where you're gonna aggregate things, kinda
Mhm.
gets technical once you dive into aggregations, but
Yeah.
yeah, exactly right.
And when it comes down, what are some of the most common best practices? Is there anything we haven't mentioned yet when it comes to creating the best practices of creating dashboards? Or if when it comes to utilizing dashboards, maybe it could be to sending reports, like don't send reports every day, send it like once a week type of thing. Like I love to get some understanding from you about like what are some of the best practices when it comes to either utilizing dashboards or creating the dashboards.
I think the best practice is I made like this presentation a while back, kind of like what our internal process is. And I called it like the S.A.F.U framework, S.A.F.U. And basically, I'd say the best practice is it has to be shareable, meaning
Mhm.
if you're making it for a client, right? I'm not sure, like if you're a service provider, like they should look at their boss or like their friends or their other entrepreneurs or their other like CEOs and be like, oh my goodness, look at how cool this is, right? Like it should be that
Mhm.
actionable. So like if it's not shareable, like usually like it's not doing good. Like you
Yeah.
should be like one person, the person is your point of contact or your boss or whoever it might be needs to be
Mhm.
sharing it. If
Yeah.
it's not actionable, like you're not actually building something that's useful. And that's my big gripe against templates
Yeah.
is like everybody can make a template. I have templates. Like I
Mhm.
deleted all of our templates because I was like, these aren't helpful to anybody. So like we used to
Yeah.
have templates that were like generating leads. And I was like, This is not helpful, like, because it's so
Baseline.
sanitized to
Yeah.
work with everything that it's not helpful. So like that's
Yeah.
the A in actionable. It has to be fast. So I'd say like a sub 3-second load time is the F. So S.A.F. S.A.F.U. Um,
Mhm.
is F, and then U is it's like use a universal language and hopefully be predicting of the future. So like the goal is that you can have a universal language that everybody understands, and then also you can use that to look into the future of saying, hey, what is this number going to do? So like that's kind of like the best practice is like that S.A.F.U. If you can run through all those letters that I just ran through and like hit replay and go back a minute and rewatch this, if you can hit all those, you're going to be doing well.
So, question for you: when you have a large team and you are building this dashboard for a large team, how do you create your multi-level dashboards for those people? For example, the CEO, very surface level, so he's going to know only want to know the high level versions of the number, and then once you start getting lower and lower, where the people go more in the weeds, and creating the dashboard for them. So do you go through and like making maybe a high level page and then keep going down to the in the weeds pages? What is your structure for creating these dashboards for large teams that are going to have different data points? What's your process for creating those?
Yeah, it depends on how siloed the company is, which is
Yeah.
like a communication problem. So we've got
Mhm.
one company that like they don't want to share information between teams. Their teams are so large, they're like, we don't want to share this with team A with team B. So we like have methods of like excluding those pages from each other's reports based off of like
Wow.
a whole bunch of like case statements and crazy like BigQuery linking things. But if your team wants to share information, let's have that assumption. Let's have something about like, hey, we're cool with marketing seeing how much advertising is spending and market and advertising seeing how much revenue marketing is getting attributed and how much the email. Everyone's cool with seeing everything.
Mhm.
What I'd kind of recommend is that you start with the highest level of saying, hey, these are the questions that the CMO or director of marketing. Like we usually don't
Yeah.
go to CEOs because the CMO is like the translator into that meeting.
Mhm.
Sometimes we'll pull a report and put together like a presentation style, like Looker Studio report, but for the most part, that's how it will work. And so basically start the highest level and then ask what questions do they have? And then move down a level, what questions do they have? And move down a level, and then what questions do they have? Until you are at the bottom. And that's like one vertical. And then you can move over a horizontal to another team and then go down that level. And so the goal is that everyone has an action, but what you do not want is like you have so much information that no one knows where to go. So sometimes what we'll have is like a Google sheet where like it has links to like the specific departments so that they don't even have to look at the main report and go find like their actual report. Or you just have different reports in general, like one for marketing, one for advertising, etc. Most of the time we can get away with one report. A few times we have to like kind of break things out into multiple reports for multiple teams. We try to avoid that as much as possible just because it makes more work to maintain and update and all that jazz. So that's kind of how we approach it. I don't know if I have the best practice for doing it. It's kind of a case by case basis.
Yeah, I totally get that. And when it comes down to sending reports, so I know certain people ask for it like every day, every week. Every time I sent my reports every single day to the client, it seems like they would use it the first week and then they would like their brain would get so adapted being sent every single day that they would stop using it. Because they would be so like used to the email that it's like, oh, like I don't even need to look at this sometimes. And that could have been like not be by it's not necessarily actionable or sending things like that. When it comes to sending notifications about your dashboard, is it smart to be doing it per day, every 2 days, once a week? What is your best practices of sending dashboards?
So we don't. I don't know if that's like a controversial thing, but yeah, we don't send any like automated links, automated emails, automated anything.
Got it.
Our client communication is, I'd say like 99% of our clients we have a shared Slack channel. So we have a Slack channel and we can pin things to the top of the Slack channel. So we pin the actual dashboard link. So usually like if you're a client of ours, you'll like in the actual Slack channel, you'll have a pinned dashboard link and a pinned rep link. So like if
Okay.
like I'm the rep or somebody else on our team is the rep, we'll have like the calendar link for that rep that you have, the point of
Cool.
contact. And like that's what we do. And then basically you can access it whenever you'd like to. And like, because I don't like annoy people of like, wow, this thing keeps emailing me. Like, I don't want any more emails. And so that's kind
Yeah.
of our practice, is what we have for like the client communication and reporting standpoint, is we have like a 15-minute touch base to 30-minute call, like every week or every other week, depending on the cadence of the team. So we like kind of like hop into them. What questions you guys have? Is there any insights of the report that you don't understand? We have an acronym like TLR, whatever their acronyms are that their team, like, do you know what this is? Just make sure. And we review it with them, but it's also pinned in the Slack channel. So we don't do any of that unless they like explicitly ask for it, because of the reason they just said.
That's smart. For some reason, it's the opposite for me. Almost all clients ask for me to send it either every single day or every single week to them.
Oh, interesting.
So I don't know if it's because they're just lazy and don't want to find the link, or like they don't want to go through that process, or they just like
Yeah, I
say,
don't
"Hey,
know.
Victor, just send it to me."
Yeah.
So it's interesting. If it works, it works. Is there anything else that has been top of mind for you when it comes down to, hey, I see a lot of dashboards doing this and they should be doing this? Or when it comes to any other best practices, do's or don'ts, is there anything else you can think of that has been top of mind for you lately when it comes to either creating dashboards, using dashboards, or anything else there?
I think the most like top of mind thing that we either get asked on or also have to deal with with other agencies is like, who owns what.
Mhm.
And ownership can be really like dicey, where it's like, who owns what. And what I mean by that is, so you can own the underlying data, right? So for example, say you, like, Facebook owns the Facebook data, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
in Facebook, and I think it's there for like 36 months. I'm not exactly sure. They keep changing it, whatever, however long it's there. So you can
Mhm.
only pull the last 36 months from Facebook. Facebook owns that data. But then
Mhm.
there's the connection between like that and then a database. Say you're linking Facebook to like a Google Sheet, for example, to keep it
Mhm.
simple. So someone owns the actual connector that goes between that. It could be Power My Analytics, right?
Mhm.
So like, if you have
Yeah.
the agency account, like the agency might own that, or does the client own that connection? Who owns the Google Sheet? Does the client own it, or does, like, even if you're in a company, like, does Susan own it or does Brian own it, right?
Yeah.
Like, who owns the Google Sheet? Then there's the connection from the sheet to Looker Studio. Who owns that connection, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the actual data source inside of that, and then there's the report that someone could own. Who owns all of that is something no one talks about ever. Like, that is
Yeah.
something nobody ever thinks about, is like, who owns this stuff? And
Yeah.
so that's been like pretty top of mind, of like, we try to take the approach of like, we don't own anything. We try to build it all on the client,
Wow.
because we want to make it as if we get hit by a bus, like, you're not out. Like, if like our entire team was like on a plane and the plane crashed, like, your reports don't go down. And like, if you decide to leave us, we don't want you to have a sour taste in your mouth of like, oh my goodness, these guys took all the data with them. Because
Yeah.
even if it was just a report that broke, like, they'll still think that, even if they do own it all on their Google Sheet and everything else. So like,
Mhm.
that's our approach, is like, we try to make it so that the client owns as much as they physically possible. And
Mhm.
then we just own like the actual work that we're doing and maintaining and all that jazz. And so most of our
Mhm.
clients love us for that, because we're like, we're not going to build this black box. We've been a lot of agencies that do a black box where it's like, we're going to give you these reports you can look at, but the second you stop paying your invoices, like, see ya, sayonara. I don't like that, because if I was
Mhm.
like, imagine if you bought a website, like, you paid a developer to build a website for you, and then if you stopped paying that developer, your website went down, you would be not happy. And I'm like, in the data space, people do that, where it's like, we're going to own the data and you just get the report. And I'm like, that seems kind of shady. So
Yeah.
that's the thing that like is most top of mind for me right now, of like, who owns what. No one talks about it. No one thinks about it until like you're leaving a client, or that person at the organization leaves. Like, that happened once, where like that client, like, the person left and then it broke everything because they were the Google Ads connector owner. And what happens then? So like, that is like what I'd like to like make you think about, whoever's listening to
Mhm.
this, is just, who owns it.
Yeah, that's super insightful, and you have to make that decision kind of up front because, like, that's a big it's not easy to transition all those things over to a new Google Sheet, going through the new, all the new admin permissions and things like that. If there's only one admin on any of the accounts or whatever it may be, it's gonna get really messed up real fast. So you have to go through that process pretty early and ask right up front, like, hey, who do you want the master admin to be? And who, like, the secondary admins, like who's like going through that process. So I totally agree with you. Like, that's going to be a very, very big conversation right up front. So most of my clients are okay with me owning the data, or like me like owning the Power My Analytics account and then sending that data to a sheet that I own still, mainly probably because they trust me. But like usually people are pretty okay with that as long as I like keep fixing. I'm not, when they stop paying, I don't just shut it down either. So it's just, like, I totally agree with what you're saying, but that's a really big conversation to do right up front. I totally agree.
I'd say like if you're an agency or a consultant listening, it's a huge marketing strength to be like, we don't build black box, you own everything. I feel like very truthful in saying that. Like we will bend over backwards and like lose money to make sure you own it. Like I think that's something that like I try to make sure happens, because just again, like the whole like like working in like the design field or in like a website building field, it's much more like transitional, where it's like they build a
Yep.
website, they give you the WordPress credentials, they give you the hosting thing, and like you're off to the races.
Yep.
Right. But like in this space, it's way less common. Like it's not, I guess it just also hasn't been around long enough, right? Forever it's been like, hey, build me a house. Bam, house is there.
Yeah.
Websites, build me a website. Bam, website's there. Build me a data pipeline. Wait a sec. Like what was actually involved in this?
Yeah. I think it comes from just like lack of understanding of all the things, all the pieces that goes into it. It's pretty intense. It really
Oh
is.
yeah,
Like it's not a simple thing.
oh yeah, it's not simple, and it's like hard. Like the internet and owning things is always difficult, right? It's not like the if you buy a house and the builder says I own the nails. If you don't keep paying me every month, I'm going to take the nails from your house and your house will fall down, right? Like that's kind of what it's like
Yeah.
on like a digital pipeline, where it's like, hey, if you stop paying me, I'm going to turn off like our connectors and
Yeah.
everything's going to break.
I totally agree with that. Is there anything else before we close out? Is there anything else that you wanted to make sure we covered today, or anything else that you can think of there?
No, I think we did a pretty good job.
Mhm.
The only other thing is like if you want to look at like images of things, like kind of what you were talking about in your like face or your ads reporting,
Mhm.
lookerstudio.vip, you can go, there's free visualizations. One of them is an image metric grid that is super helpful because you
Hmm.
can get a giant grid of images, 100% free. Don't even want your money. You don't have to give your email address. Actually, you can just click the button and get it. So that's the only thing that I think I didn't mention earlier on, but if you're still
Mhm.
listening, go do that.
Yeah, and please, tell them how to find you, where to find your websites. You have a lot of companies, so, like, tell them how to
Yeah.
find you, where the best way to contact you is.
If you're listening to this and you are like looking for someone to do this, like head over to Mediauthentic, like the word media and authentic smashed together, or just Google JJ Reynolds. Find me on LinkedIn. I talk a lot on LinkedIn if you're a LinkedIn user. And then if you're looking to just learn more about like how to visualize stuff, go to lookerstudio.vip. It's a kind of like a personal blog. Like I mostly just do things there that are like a little bit wacky. Head over to the about page. Hopefully it makes you laugh. And lastly, if you are wanting to like offer a service, betterthandata.com, we open the next cohort, like it opens every odd month. So January, March, like every odd month of the year. So it's kind of a cohort based system. And you can hop in there, the next cohort, whenever you're listening to this live or not live.
Cool, awesome, thank you so much. Yeah, and this is the Data Rules podcast. Thank you everyone for listening. That's all we have time for today. It's cool. See you next time.